Okay, so I want to talk about changes in the Catholic Church in the U.S. and, by extension, at least some indication of what's happening worldwide. Okay, so this Chinese character, I think, is a helpful descriptor of what we're looking at, which is both challenge and opportunity. And I want to talk about that. First, when I talk about Catholic schools, of course, when you think about Catholic, you think about nuns. And that's a very important part, obviously, of the heritage of schools. In the 1960s, probably 90% of those who taught in Catholic schools were women in religious communities. But I'm going to talk about the issue not so much of nuns, N-U-N-S, but really nuns, N-O-N-E-S, the fastest growing sector in American religion, which is people who have no religious affiliation and thus are called nuns. Especially true among the millennials. If you look here, among millennials in 2015, 36% are nuns, 27% in 2017 say they're spiritual but not religious, 37% atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular. So longitudinally, what you find is the big increase of nuns, spiritual, not religious, and atheist, agnostic, etc. They also estimate that among all population, not just millennials, 64 million atheists in the United States. So if you look at the percent of unaffiliated by age, again, a dramatic representation. The older you are, the more likely you are to be religiously affiliated. And I would imagine in your families and friends you see that trend in an anecdotal way that is complemented by data. So it's also a time of great religious switching, people leaving one, kind of shopping for churches or shopping for religion. And you can see in the gold, that's the number leaving and compared to the number joining. So the big story is the joining the ranks of the unaffiliated and very few leaving. Likewise, evangelical Protestants somewhat holding steady, just a bit of an increase. Historically, black Protestant churches are losing, mainline Protestant, but the big loser really is those who were leaving the Catholic Church. And for every 6.5 people leave the Catholic Church, only one joins. Important to note, why has the Catholic population decreased considerably? It's due to immigrants. Nonetheless, 1/3 of all adults who were baptized Catholic are no longer Catholic, and you can see by denomination the second largest group of former Roman Catholics. So, former Catholics comprised 30 million people in 2016. That number would be up. The number of Catholics, 74.2. Why was there growth with all these departures? Again, immigration. So this is another study by Pew of those who leave the church. 52% who left the Catholic Church at some point in their lives. 11% reverted, 13% are cultural Catholics, and 28% are ex-Catholics. So you can see that departure. It'd be interesting to see how the 11% reverted and who they are and how that happened. So the overall religious composition in the U.S., less than half Protestant, the second largest group unaffiliated Catholics now, and you can see the other faiths. 36% attend religious services weekly, 42% no longer identify with their childhood religion, 55% believe in heaven and hell, 25% in neither. So, according to Pew, 59% of those who identify with Catholicism are still would self-identify, and you could see where that goes. What was surprising to me with these data is I thought more Catholics would have gone to other religious communities, but really, when they tend to leave the church, they tend to leave religion altogether. Mentioned earlier, this shifting demographics within the country, moving to the south and west from the northeast and midwest, the areas that were traditionally strong with Catholic immigrants from Europe, and of course the changing ethnic complexion of the ethnic transformation from heavy majority white, non-Hispanic, to Hispanic. And yet, younger Hispanics are less likely to be Catholic. So that challenging trend that we find also is not, it continues with the Latino subset as well as with the broader population. Now, along with leaving the church, there's the issue of staying in the church, but really, I suppose you could say, departing in place, if you will, or becoming cultural Catholic, or very occasional. And one important measure of that is participation in the sacraments. Now you can see, according to CARA, the Center for Applied Research on the Apostolate, in 2017, if you look at the almost first, 16 years of the 21st century, look at the number of baptisms, first communions, confirmations, and marriages. Again, an important sign of an increasing disaffiliation with the Catholic Church. Now, it's not unique to the Catholic Church, but it is common to across religious groups generationally. All right, so Vern Bengtson did an important study which looked at how religion is passed down across generations. Again, a crucial issue for those of us in public and Catholic education. So, to what extent are parents passing on their faith? Talking about millennials who do a lot of religious shopping and move especially to no religious affiliation. And in their sample, only 4 in 10 Catholic parents had young adult children indicating they were still Catholic. And look at the decline between 1970 and 2005. David Kinnaman also did an important study of why young Christians are leaving the church. The church in the West is struggling to connect with the next generation. Talks about all of the changes, and we are learning how to pass on a faith worth claiming in a new context. So question for any planning, for any Catholic school, how can we prepare the next generation to live meaningfully and follow Jesus wholeheartedly in these changing times? More studies done of the disaffiliation of young people by Christian Smith and his associates among young adolescents and emerging adults. He would claim 1/3 have absolutely no religion, 1/3 are quite indifferent, 1/3 would consider themselves practicing in some Christian faith. He describes a kind of faith which he calls moral therapeutic deism, which is the religion of many millennials in his, according to his research, which is sort of a, no demand, feel good, what one theologian described as kind of the religion of whatever. So I think we've seen some of that in our own experience too. The same Christian Smith group did a study of young adult Catholics, and this CARA study of the dynamics of disaffiliation. We'll talk about these. So, young Catholics in America, except for lower levels of church attendance, even lower than Protestants, amazingly, and Protestants, of course, who have no expectation of weekly worship the way we do. They look like other emerging adults. Those that attend a Catholic high school are significantly more religious 5 years later, when they're emerging adults, meaning in their 20s, and yet much of the difference, according to the research, is done to the religious identity or the religiousness of families and not so much the school effect. In the other study, the Going, Going, Gone, being done for Catholics. This is young Catholics who have left, who are being surveyed and interviewed of being finished with Catholicism. Where do they go? No religious affiliation, atheism, a different religious faith expression or religious practice. And when do they go? Which is really interesting. Look at 50% on the right, between 13 and 20. I was surprised between ages 10 and 12, 24% says something too about those elementary or middle school ages. So I think they make the case clear that given these data, that it is incumbent upon Catholic schools to reflect upon, to understand, and to respond to these trends of departing from religion. Now, when we look at Catholic education in itself, it's important, I think, to remember that very often we Americans see the entire world like this. Right? We tend to be very parochial in the pejorative sense. We tend to not see the broader world. And so when we look at the U.S., we say, wow, Catholic schools, it's time on the Titanic. It's kind of all over. And I wouldn't say it's the Titanic, but clearly it's been a great decline. The worldwide picture is vastly different, as you can see. Where you've had great decline in the U.S., you've had enormous growth, especially in the southern hemisphere, places like sub-Saharan Africa. It mirrors the issue of Catholic schools, mirrors the broader demographic changes within the Catholic Church over the 20th century and into the first decade of the 21st. What's the big story? Decline of Europe, 65 to 24%, and we know that is continuing. It's even more than it was in 2010 in the last 8 years. Pew just came out with a study of religion in Europe, and the decline of Catholicism is tremendous, as well as many other mainstream religions, Protestant religions. If you look at the other big story, growth in North America, more significant growth in Latin America, however, and the Asia Pacific, again, a huge area of growth. So those shifting demographics to the Southern Hemisphere, and every prediction is that these trends will continue according to the Population Reference Bureau. We will become a Southern Hemisphere church. Now, a little anecdote. So a number of years ago, I was involved in a study done by, in a study group sponsored by the Lilly Foundation, and we looked at the development of Jewish schools. There were 6 Jews and 6 Catholics involved in a 2-year collaborative study of education. And one of the rabbis once said, talked about the growth of Jewish day schools, especially in parts of the country where Jews were not very numerous in the past, like the South. And what's the rationale for a Jewish school? The tragedy of a young Jew growing up without knowing the joy of a Jewish way of life. I thought a lovely way to express a rationale for a faith-related school. I wonder, is a rationale for Catholic schools the tragedy of a young Catholic growing up without knowing the joy of a Catholic way of life? Now, when I've said this to people in many different groups in many different settings, very often what people say is, joy? Catholic? I don't put those things together. And I think we need to really communicate, not even by words, but much more by our lives, by our joy, by our enthusiasm, that Catholic way of life is a way of life worth passing on to the next generation. And I think of late, we have, with Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, I think some real helpful leads as to how to change and plan and transform our schools to communicate to young people, to the next generation, that Catholicism, in fact, is a joyous way of life. And when I say joyous, it certainly makes demands, right? The gospel makes demands, there's no question about that. But there has to be a sense of joy. So in the Evangelii Gaudium, we hear the Pope writing that the joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of all who encounter Jesus. Those who accept his offer of salvation are set free from sin, sorrow, inner emptiness, and loneliness. With Christ, joy is constantly born anew. So what the Pope did with Evangelii Gaudium to encourage the Christian faithful to embark on a new chapter of evangelization marked by joy. I think that's a great element of any strategic plan for a Catholic school. Proclaiming Christ, he goes on, means showing that to believe in and follow him is not only something right and true, but is beautiful and capable of filling life with new splendor and profound joy, even in the midst of difficulty. Talked about one of the problems, the breakdown in the way that Catholics pass down the Christian faith. The disillusionment that we saw in a lot of the statistics, right? Growing numbers of parents who do not bring their children for baptism or teach them how to pray. We saw that in the sacramental numbers, right? The causes, a lack of opportunity for dialogue in families, the influence of media, a relativistic subjectivism, which means there's no such thing really as truth, an unbridled consumerism, which feeds the market and makes people see what is worthwhile is owning and wealth, a lack of pastoral care among the poor, and finally, the failure of institutions to be welcoming. When you think about your own setting, how do these factors come into play? So, we have to be a welcoming church. Part of our baptized people lack a sense of belonging due to certain structures and the unwelcoming atmosphere of some of our parishes and communities, or a bureaucratic way of dealing with problems in the lives of people. Administrative as opposed to pastoral. Pastoral ministry, then, is not obsessed with disjointed transmission of a multitude of doctrines to be insistently imposed. You know, when I talk about the joy of a Catholic way of life, often people will say, well, Catholicism, it's, illicit, invalid, prohibited, etc. The message has to concentrate on the essentials, what is most beautiful, grand, appealing, at the same time most necessary. The message has to be simplified without losing its depth and truth. And so charisms are crucial elements of that, right? That the Holy Spirit enriches the evangelizing church with different charisms that build up the church. And I think the charism of leadership is really something that you feel called to and to consider as you think of your own vocation and your own ministry. We know, as in schools generally, but in Catholic schools in particular, very heavily, it is the work now of lay women, and acknowledging that the pastoral responsibilities that women have, but how to create still broader opportunities for a more inclusive female presence. Youth ministry, the Pope says, suffered the impact of these changes. So as adults, we find it hard to listen patiently to them, to appreciate their concerns and demands, to speak to them in a language they can understand. Our efforts in the field of education do not produce the results expected. Why? As he said, the lack of listening. But progress has been made in calling the entire community to evangelize and educate, and having young people exercise greater leadership. All of it passing on a faith worth claiming. Despite the present crisis of commitment, and I see this very much with millennials, right? Young people making common cause with the problems of the world, activism and volunteer work. A lot of them, when we talk in Jesuit language about faith and justice, they buy easily into the justice dimension, but the faith dimension is very difficult for them. They don't see the intrinsic connection between the two. As young people are idealistic, he says, we're called to renew an expanse of hope. They recommend new directions for humanity, open us up to the future, lest we cling to a nostalgia for structures and customs that are no longer life-giving. Wow. I think that's a real important, again, an agenda for change and planning. So I would ask that you take a look, if you want to see more of particularities for Catholic education, looking at the congregation in the Vatican, very much under the influence of Pope Francis and recent documents. Be interesting to take a look at them yourself, to share them with your faculty, to see that as an ongoing professional development, a consideration when we look back at some of the books, for example, Transforming the Schools Through Systems Change. These could be some elements of systems change. And to take advantage in the more immediate of the 2018 October Synod, where all the bishops of the world will be gathered to talk about young people of the faith and vocational discernment. In order to prepare for this, the Pope talks about listening to young people, and in fact, surveys were sent around the world to hear the voices of young people, to get their experience. And this is what in the Instrumentum Laboris, the working paper for the Synod itself, based on what has been reported, that we need supportive, uplifting, authentic, and accessible communities. Supportive, uplifting, authentic, and accessible. How does your school measure up in regard to that? The importance of supporting families, not just youth. We saw that. Remember the study that talked about Catholic parents and handing on the faith. Many parishes are no longer places of connection. Very often the school now becomes the only place of connection. The school principal could be the only pastoral presence in the lives of families. We need a church that is inclusive, welcoming, merciful, and tender, and to see diversity as a richness and finding opportunities in diversity in our pluralistic world. The importance of engaging with and addressing the social justice issues of our time. In other words, to be credible by our actions. Matthew 25, right? Whatsoever you do to the least of my brothers and sisters, you do for me. The wide gap between the desires of young people and their capacity to make long-term decisions. How do we help people in their own vocational discernment? He talked about, sorry that there's not a bullet there, the ambiguity of technology, which is certainly a challenge, as we know. Living in a world of social media has tremendous opportunities, but it also brings with it great challenges. And helping young people search for meaning in life. As I say often, Catholic schools not only prepare people to make a living, more importantly, they prepare people to make a life. Young people want authentic witnesses. How is that reflected in the life of your school? They need to encounter the mission of Christ. They are attracted to joy, which should be a hallmark of our faith. Many of them don't know how to go about discernment. We talked about that earlier with the ability to make decisions. And today's young people are longing for an authentic church. So I hope that this was helpful. Again, challenge and opportunity. And I think altogether appropriate to think about these issues when we're considering planning and change in Catholic schools.